This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 185. Davos does diddly squat.
So the world leaders have met at Davos, they've parked their private jets, they've listened to Greta, and they've basically done nothing. In fact, the head of the World Bank didn't even bother attending. So did Davos do diddly squat for climate change? Well, yes, it did really, didn't it? So what should be done? Well, we'll look at that today on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. So you do realise, Steve, that all this talk of climate change at Davos and just generally this talk of climate change and these doom-saying prophets, Donald Trump's words, actually, we've got to reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse. That's what Donald Trump said. I think he was talking to you there and other climate change supporters. And I know you people like you, Steve, you it's just a ruse by, the far left like you to challenge the established capitalist world, to replace it with communism that takes away our freedoms and destroys our living standards. All this climate change is crap. Tell us what you're really about. You don't believe in climate change. You are just trying to get your communist ways and get rid of capitalism. That's what it's all about, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's a total fraud. Yep. There's 60,000 climate scientists are all there are actually closet communists. Yeah. Of course. Obviously they are. But I mean, this is, I am astounded. The reason why I said that was I heard someone on the radio, a right-wing commentator, saying just that. And you do hear it a lot, don't you? That it's a very, very successful tactic because what it's done is paint this in the classical left versus right political agenda of the last 50 years. Yeah. You take it back to the French Revolution seriously, but the last 50 years of politics, it's left versus right, and all this stuff is, it's the snowflake versus the hard men of industry. It's communists versus free marketeers, et cetera, et cetera. This is an anti-free market, pro-communist vision. It must be stopped at all costs, et cetera, et cetera. That's been a very effective framing of the whole debate, because we get stuck in the, Republicans don't believe in climate change and Democrats do division, as if it was originating in politics. And the thing is, it originated in physics and engineering. And that is the real travesty of all this. But I would last week, just shortly after Davos had finished, I was being interviewed by George Galloway, and George said, he quoted the words of Donald Trump and the predictions of the apocalypse. I know he listens to this show. He's going to be appalled at my impression of him. But he doesn't actually listen in. We should actually get him to listen to a couple of times.
He said he does. He said he does listen. So he's going to be appalled at my impression of him. But, I sort of agree that these people who are going too far, he's lost Scottish now. I think he's moved to Ireland, so I'll stop doing the impression. But I mean, his point was, that a bit like Donald Trump is saying, are we not helping ourselves when we become these perennial prophets of doom? Is there perhaps and Greta Thunberg, for example, got a very important message to relay, but, she is a child manipulated by these anti-capitalists. She's had her childhood stolen from her by the adults who are pursuing this agenda of their own. And, it's all, again, just feeding this climate change denying machine, isn't it? And the more you say, we've only got a few years left before it all goes to shit, the more ammunition that they're given. I mean, perhaps there needs to be, I don't know, you want to make it a more nuanced debate, but also you want to say that, but this is serious. We can't spend 50 years on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's debating as you approach the iceberg, whether the iceberg's made of ice or snow, or ice or mist. That's what it amounts to, unfortunately. And that's why I say it's not the lefties didn't originate this. The engineers and the physicists did. If you go back, I think it's Fourier, an extremely important person in mathematics, who first worked out that because of the absorbent, because carbon dioxide effectively captured captured light wavelength radiation effectively, and re-emitted it as infrared. Therefore, you go from light to warmth. Because it did that, therefore, there was a greenhouse effect, meaning that light, the reason a greenhouse is warmer than the surrounding land is that light, which would if there was no greenhouse roof on top of a greenhouse, then the sunlight would come in and bounce and be absorbed by the planets to some extent, but most would be reflected back into outer space. Because the roof of the greenhouse is there, the light comes in through the greenhouse, goes back, hits the greenhouse and bounces back down again, and stays longer, and therefore the temperature is higher in the greenhouse. That's why it's called the greenhouse effect. Now, that was a physicist. When it comes to the people who first said this potentially raises systemic threats for human civilization, it was the limits to growth. And the limits to growth, the two authors we hear about most are the Meadows husband and wife team and Randers, Jorgen Randers, who's still alive and kicking and still working on this area. But the person who was the original architect was J. Forrester. Now, J. Forrester's initial claim to fame was he did the mathematics that designed the shooting characteristics of the turrets on American warships in World War II. Okay? We're talking one of the world's great engineers. Without him, they probably wouldn't have lost against the Germans, but he gave them serious capabilities to beat the Germans and beat the Japanese by having better mathematics behind the gun turrets in naval conflict. So we ain't talking a lefty here. We're talking a serious engineer. And then he put the whole idea of in fact, the technology that was behind limits to growth was first used to explain to a manufacturing firm that he was consulting for in Massachusetts somewhere, like why they had cycles. They couldn't understand why they'd be ramping up production and ramping it down again, up in dramatic volatility in the internal workflow of this one manufacturing firm. And he simply sketched out a relationship as saying, well, let's say you've got you come up with a new product and somebody one of your engineers invents a new product, and you then have to turn it from an idea into a working prototype, and then you've got to build the machinery to make the working prototype on a regular basis so you can manufacture the item. Then you've got to market it. Then you've got to get your suppliers to bring their materials in time and so on. And he said, when you put all this together, you get a whole series of time lags that cause cycles. So it came from an engineering and management background. And then when it applied to the global economy, same sort of story. You can bring out fundamental parameters of the global economy. Obviously, the population is one. The food production is another. Pollution absorption capability is the third characteristic. There are about 7 all up that they had. And they said, when you look at the interactions between these, they weren't looking to get cycles out of the model. They're saying that you will ultimately, if you continue this rate of growth on the planet, then you will get to a point where one of 5 or 6 different sorts of breakdowns occur, because you either start running out of natural resources, which is not the primary one they talked about, or you start generating too much pollution, or you start breaking down your food system, et cetera, and these complicated feedback effects will undermine the viability of the global economy. Now, again, that was a challenge to the free marketeers, because what it implied was, if you just let the economy go as it's going right now, we're going to have a crisis in the future. Therefore, we have to, oh my God, plan, and that included the two scenarios that actually led to sustainable outcomes of the 14 they looked at. Both had to include population control, but it also included, ramping up, pushing up the level of research into renewable resources, reducing loads on food systems, controlling, reducing plastic waste, yada, yada, yada. That's the whole range of different things had to be done. And then we could have a sustainable future. Now, the whole idea that the market economy didn't reach a long-run equilibrium which could cope with any disturbance was just too much for the neoclassicals on one side, but also too much for the oil companies and the coal companies on the other. And even though I think it was Exxon first worked out that there would be serious consequences for the planet back in the 1970s, they worked out in the 70s that within 40 years we'd start seeing serious breakdowns and the ecological sustainability of the planet. The oil industry, out of self-interest, and neoclassical economists out of ideology, both went on the attack against the limits to growth and disparaged and put it down. And part of that was saying it's lefties. It wasn't lefties. It isn't lefties. It's engineers and physicists.
Right, but the Club of Rome, going back, that's used as an argument, isn't it, by a lot of people. And in fact, Greta Thunberg mentioned this in her speech the other day at Davos, that we'll find a solution through technology. So we'll always find ways of coping. So, Club of Rome warned us against the increasing population, but and the devastation that was going to cause, and gave a very short timeline on that. And yet we managed to feed ourselves because we through more intensive agriculture and whatever else we did, more fast food outlets perhaps. We did stuff to get more food to people. And couldn't we just find a technological solution if we allocated the right resources? And I guess there's a lot of people who are saying, even if it is real, we'll find a way. We always have in the past.
Well, that's the sort of thinking you'll find behind Ted Nordhaus's most recent paper. Exactly that, a sort of technological wonderland future. That technology can absolve all ills, and capitalism will generate the technology. So don't worry about it. And therefore, anybody who does worry about it is anti-capitalist. Yeah, that's the way. And
we'll just point to the fact that yes, the Club of Rome's predictions didn't come true.
And of course, you also point to a document. Not a prediction. This is what I've lost my temper once. Well, I forgot what I was talking about. I got bloody angry.
Well, I'm going to stop prodding you now. It's going to just stay tuned. I'll see if I can make you lose.
Yes, so many times people will say they predicted we're going to run out of chromium by 1975 or something like that. They had a table in the document about I think it's table 4. It's about a 5 or 6 page table of various resources, known reserves, rate of rundown of those reserves, and expected depletion rates under different rates of growth of the economy. That was a table predominantly, there's a couple of extra sources in it, predominantly a table produced by the Department of Mines and Municipal Department of Mines. And they simply reproduced the table as an example of what could happen given current reserves. But they knew there were going to be new reserves discovered, like oil, for example, that would continue discovering new oil resources post-1970. So that table had nothing to do with their model. Okay, the model itself was a set of it's a mess to look at because of the technology they use, which system dynamics, which has wires going everywhere. It looks like a bowl of spaghetti spilt over a bunch of of pretzels. That's what it looks like when you take a look at the whole diagram. But it was a set of differential equations with about 7 components to it, none of which were chromium, aluminium, or anything else. There was an index set for known resources back in 1900, and they then tracked the level of those resources between 1900 and 1970 to make sure the index matched. There was an index for population, there was an index for pollution, index for food production, and so on. And those indices were what the predictions were about, not chromium, not aluminium, yada, yada, yada. So when people say, they said we were going to run out of oil by 2010. No, they effing didn't. They simply had a table, and you idiots have treated the table as if that's predictions of the model.
Right.
And of course, this is another way
so it was an input to the model.
It wasn't even an input. Yes, it was an input. It was part of what they did to produce the index of, I presume they used, I did reread the book again, but I'm pretty certain that was not actually an input. It was an example of someone else looking at these with a very limited intellectual framework. And they were saying, let's have an extended framework that looks at the feedbacks between one component of the global ecological system and other components over time. And then when they did that, and they deliberately did not put obvious states on the horizontal axis. So the horizontal axis for the graphs they had this is the final part of the book where they are doing the runs from the computer model now. They had 1900 at one end of the axis and 2100 at the other. You have to eyeball to work out where the peaks might actually appear, and the peaks tend to be in 2030. So what they were saying is on their extrapolations of their indices, not these physical amounts of commodities that were in this Department of Mines tables, they implied a range of different sorts of crises depending on things like, how many resources were there, what rate of discovery might there be, what technological rate of growth was there, what population growth was there. Putting all those together, in every case bar two, I think, certainly bar one, I think bar two of their scenarios, that led to a breakdown including a collapse in population as a consequence of the breakdowns in other parts of the system. And it's an engineering, it's not a lefty, it's engineering. But it challenged the right-wing pro-free market orientation of economists and, of course, the right-wing pro-free market orientation of oil companies.
Well, it's because the right-wing, of course, don't want to do anything. They don't want any influence to be had on the way the market operates currently. So America doesn't need to do anything, of course, because as Donald Trump said, perhaps missing the point slightly, that climate change can't be a problem because they have such clean water in America. And he's going to join the 1 trillion trees initiative. He didn't actually say how many he's going to plant, but the plan is there's this initiative to plant 1 trillion trees by 2050. Meanwhile, over 3,000 square miles of Amazon rainforest was cleared last year. So planting new trees elsewhere, it does feel a bit like a sticking plaster solution. I guess it's good that it's happening. But it's, I mean, the problem is when we have these initiatives, it's just like, well, okay, something's being done. We don't need to worry about it now.
Well, it's trivialising all the way through, and this is the trouble. They've trivialised the dangers, and neoclassical economists have played an enormous role in this. Certainly starting with Nordhaus, who was the person who, first of all, demolished the perceived credibility of the limits to growth study by misinterpreting it, and then the reply from Jay Forrester was published in a journal economists don't read. So he actually took apart Nordhaus's critique and showed it was flawed, showed it was wrong. But what you then had is this whole reframing of the debate, left versus right, all these lefties, and of course the classic stuff, all these climate scientists conspiring so they can get their massively generous research grants. What a joke. I mean, one of the reasons I left the academic sector, I'm sick and tired of the performing monkey stuff you have to go through. Putting in research grants where 1 in 10 grants are going to succeed overall, and you're wasting your bloody time filling out forms and answering questions from bureaucrats. You're having your ideas reviewed by people who, if the idea is original, then they haven't thought of it. Therefore, they decide, well, I haven't thought of it. It doesn't deserve funding. So you get zilch genuine money, and you waste an enormous amount of your time writing these. It's their vision of the amount of money and the lifestyle of the academics who do this is just.
And yet it's leveled. It's leveled, isn't it? That people are on this climate change bandwagon because they're getting paid for it.
They're making money out of it. Now that is a total joke. I mean, anybody working as a climate scientist, particularly if you don't voluntarily choose to go and spend half your life in Antarctica. I have friends who've spent 6 months in Antarctica. It's not a fun place. You wouldn't not do it because of the contribution you've made to humanities knowledge, and that's what really motivates genuine academics and researchers. Yeah. But they ain't doing it for a cushy lifestyle.
No, become a day trader and have a nice lunch. That's a better choice, isn't it? Look,
fundamentally,
realistically, is government policy ever going to change? Because if we look at in Australia last month, we had the mid-year economic outlook. It's the halfway budget. Which pledged to supply more money for training in the mining industry, because clearly the mining industry can't afford it themselves to train people to keep, for the new wave of people to be employed in that industry, even though a lot of it's actually done by machines these days and by robots. But obviously, they wanted to do something because it contributes so much to the economy. And the other thing that Australia is saying they're going to do, develop more free trade agreements to increase demand for their mineral exports from a country which is already the world's largest exporter of coal. And of course, they're offering subsidies for new coal mines in Australia as well. When we've got that sort of approach, I mean, that is, that's going the wrong way, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And then this trouble is, and there's actually a wonderful analogy called lily in the pond. Have you heard of it?
No. I think I have heard it, but yeah, tell me more.
Yeah. If you have a lily, which is in a pond, and the lily doubles in size every day, and after 31 days, it's half the size of the pond, on which day does it cover the entire pond?
The next day.
Yes. Okay. And most people don't realize that. Most people get it wrong. The thing is, when you've got an exponential process in a bounded system, then the breakdown comes in the very last doubling. or the very last increase. And so you can be doing absolutely fine for 29 out of 30 days, 30 out of 31, 31 out of 32, all looks good. 32, bang.
Yeah.
The pond is completely covered in starves.
So I have to interrupt you there now because because now you're becoming a doomsayer and you're only doing it because you're trying to break down the established capitalist world. But so what do you think about Greta Thunberg then? I mean, at Davos, she said that instantly we should halt all investments in fossil fuel exploration and extraction, immediately end all fossil fuel subsidies, and immediately and completely divest from fossil fuels. I mean, this would be devastating for an economy like Australia. So does it, I mean, if we were to do that, I mean, first of all, does it make sense? Is that a good first step? And if we do that, what do we do? We'd need some sort of subsidy, wouldn't we, for economies that are dependent on fossil fuels? Because otherwise,
we'd have a huge reduction in energy output, and then for a dramatic collapse in production. And that would not have been necessary if we'd actually reacted to the limits to growth back in 1972. We're virtually talking half a century ago.
Right. So she's not talking a great deal of sense there. Then I mean, she's talking a lot of sense because we waited 50 years to do anything. Right.
And therefore, if you get to that point, then.
But if we did all of that tomorrow, then the economy everywhere is. Just falls apart.
We might see a 75% fall. And what people like Nordhaus and Ted Nordhaus as well, and Toll and so on and so forth, are saying that that would impose incredible costs on the third world. Nordhaus said it'd be burning the village down to save it. We're better off having the growth, and then with the growth, we're much better able to cope with the consequences in the future. Now, when you that is linear thinking in an exponential world. So if you are the lily in the pond argument, if you're at the day 31, you can't say we've got to let it continue growing. No, you've got to stop it. Otherwise, the pond gets totally covered, and then all the fish beneath the plant suffocate. You cannot apply this thinking when the process is exponential and exhausting a constrained system. And the whole part, their argument is, well, the system's not constrained, or the lake, technology is making the pond grow faster than the lily, and the lily will never cover the pond. That's their framework.
I don't understand.
You look at it, it ain't growing that fast.
I don't understand the situation in Australia anyway, aside from if we ignore the impact of climate change. If you've got, because Australia is the largest exporter of coal, and they tell us it's a better coal. It's in demand because it's
anthracite. Yeah.
So you would have thought if you produce more coal mines right now, which is what Australia is doing, you're going to push prices down because you're increasing supply of that good quality coal. Wouldn't it be better to try and constrain that supply to keep the prices high, and then also earn more by charging higher royalties? If there's such demand for it, then take more money from it, from the countries that are demanding it, and then use that money for succession planning, which would obviously be investing in renewables, or what you're going to do when that coal runs out. But they're not doing any of that.
No, none of that. Like, the coal won't run out. This is like in terms of our resources. I think we've got enough coal. Like, and if there were no consequences to the ecology for using the coal, I think we've got enough coal and current energy growth trends to continue for another 300 years. So coal we're never going to run out of. We'll run out of life on the planet long before we run out of coal.
Right.
That is ironic because coal itself was once life on the planet.
And the interesting thing in Australia is as well, they're decreasing the employment benefits from it all because they're investing in robot trucks, robot trains. So they're digging up the country, shipping it out, taking these low royalties, not even creating many jobs. It's just the foreign earnings that they're gaining from it. Nuts, isn't it? And
don't forget Gina Ronhart. She gets a few dollars.
She gets quite a bit of it as well, absolutely, and quite a lot of influence. Look, if we go back to 2006, we had the Stern review on climate change. It said, using the results from formal economic models, the review estimates that if we don't act, the overall costs and risks of climate change will be the equivalent to losing at least 5% of global GDP each year, now and forever. If a wider range of risks are taken into account, the estimates of damage could rise to 20% of GDP or more. In contrast, the costs of action, reducing greenhouse gas emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, can be limited to around 1% of global GDP each year. That's what they said. That was 14 years ago. So have we really seen GDP hit by 5% each year for the last 14 years?
So we're saying once you get to the temperature levels, 2 and 3 degrees above current levels. Stern was a more reasonable version of the same sort of stuff that Nordhaus does, where you use current data about GDP and temperature to predict what's going to happen when global temperatures rise. But what he applied was a lower discount rate, a discount rate of about 1%.
Yeah.
And therefore his damages came out as higher than Nordhaus's. And it was all the debate over the discount rate. And until I started researching this stuff, I thought I would find that the main reason Nordhaus got the trivial damages he got was by having a very high rate of discount. I instead have found that he assumed that the damages would be trivial. He started off, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, by assuming that 87% of American GDP would be unaffected by climate change of any scale. And if you say 87% is not affected, then there's only 13% that can be damaged. Of the 13% he said could be damaged, 3% he said was in high exposure, but he gave figures saying it might be positive or negative. 10%, maybe $10 billion damages in 1988 prices to $9 billion worth of benefits, line ball call. That left just 2 areas where there's going to be damages. One of those was electricity demand. He said the damages will be $1.65 billion per year in 1988 dollars, I think. I took a look at the original data. The data he was using said $33 to $73 billion worth of damages. So, I have never seen such fraudulent garbage in my life as I'm finding and reading all the stuff on climate change.
Well, in some cases, climate change could be a good thing, couldn't it? If you are a fuel producer, you look at a country like Australia, for example. Okay, aside from the obvious news that Australia has been burning down, but it's not been burning down in central Sydney and central Melbourne. All we've seen is those increasing temperatures and unclean air have forced people to turn on their air conditioning. So power consumption has increased. So actually, better return for the companies producing the energy. So the impact, the economic impact in Australia might be quite minimal. In fact, could be the opposite, couldn't it?
This is where the whole conceptualization of climate change in most of the public and most of the mainstream economists is just completely
garbage.
It's just not even in the right ball. It's garbage. It's not in the right ballpark because. But
in these the reason I raise that because in these, if the models are looking at inputs and you're looking at power consumption and the impact of that, then couldn't it go the other way?
Well, let's look at, there's actually an excellent book which I recommend people reading as long as they're sitting down called 6 Degrees by a guy called Mark Linus. It's about a 2007 book. I think it's getting quite dated now. But what he did was take a look at what was the globe like when the temperatures were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 degrees respectively higher than current day temperatures, and therefore feed that back to what would human societies be like in those regions. Now, this is a summary people can find on the web of 6 degrees. We'll put the link up on the podcast. Under 3 degrees, which is pretty much baked in. That's it's
we're going there.
Yeah. We're not going to stop at 1.5. We're not going to stop at 2. 3 is quite likely. This is just a dot point on Australia again. Australia will become the world's driest nation. So it's the second driest continent right now. The driest being Antarctica. But it's not the driest nation. If you went to I don't know whichever country has most of the Sahara Desert,
Libya,
the world's driest nation. Yeah. So Australia's going to become drier than that nation. Days when temperatures exceed 40 degrees will increase 6-fold. The drought frequency will triple, and rainfall plummet by 25% with extreme winds. Australia's main rivers will lose between 25% and 50% of their flow. Now, try to imagine
what a great opportunity you've talked about there, Steve, for the energy industry. They can, and for the water industry, we can spend money on desalination plants. We can,
all over that's right.
There's technology can solve all of that,
and all the pipes we can build,
and help the economy at the same time.
Yeah, and that's the technological dreamism that's used in the other direction, so that the right gets associated with the level of technological dreaming. And you look at the rate of technology change necessary to achieve the sort of outcomes they're talking about. Again, this is where I come back to Nordhaus's reduction of a $33 to $73 billion figure by the United States Environmental Protection Agency to $1.65 billion. The only way it could have done that is by assuming a rate of technological change of 4.5 to 5.5% per annum, which is about 3 times the rate of technological change.
But
when you aggregate.
But isn't that, I mean, the reason why I was giving that as an example was because isn't that part of the problem with a lot of these models? We tend to look at the impact of climate change. What does a rising temperature mean for economic output? And we look at worker productivity or agricultural impact, whereas what you're saying is, well, it's something slightly more significant than that. You're sort of like looking at a model which is really saying, the impact is going to be at the edges, not in the core.
That's pretty much it. It's always saying this stuff is going to be undesirable but manageable. That's the way they put it across. Yeah. When in fact, when you look at what is involved in raising the temperature of the planet by 3 degrees, is a ludicrous level of retention of additional energy from the sun. It's not our consumption of energy and dumping that into the biosphere that matters. If we just generated waste energy, it all radiates into outer space. It's the fact that we're adding a layer which traps that and therefore warms the planet, and therefore the temperature of all the biological actions on the planet shift dramatically. And in terms like if there was a 3 degree increase in temperature, that would mean on across the entire planet, because most of the planet is ocean. That 3 degree increase in the temperature of the air, on the average, would increase to about a 10 degree increase in the temperature in the inland of continents. Now, 10 degrees increase in the major land masses is going to make major parts of them uninhabitable. And you simply can't extrapolate from today's economy to an economy where it's 3 degrees warmer. But that's precisely what mainstream economists are doing. And then back to Davos again. This is where the climate change denialism comes in, because they're looking at reports and saying, well, the IPCC itself says that a 3 degree increase in temperature will only reduce GDP by 2%. Who wrote the IPCC report? Richard Toll. Right. Who is one of these economists and climate change trivializers. So what they're quoting is the economists saying it's not going to be much impact. So the oil companies can quote the economists to justify the oil companies being self-interested and saying it's only a trivial thing. They're both, I think the oil companies had a better idea of what actually is involved in this. But the commercial denialism is supported by theoretical denialism, and it's put across as a left versus right thing when it's an engineering and ecology vision versus the fantasy of a techno fairy.
I was just thinking an interesting study. I wonder how many climate change deniers, I wonder how many of them have got children, and whether their concern is short term because they haven't got any legacy in their family. Look, just on this trivializing, and I know you're not a big supporter of the idea of carbon trading, but I mean, at least it was a way of trying to use our existing economic systems to try and find a solution. But it was trivialized, wasn't it? Because if we look at Germany, for example, they're announcing a carbon trading scheme that's going to start next year. That places a value of $10 per ton of carbon. Seems pretty trivial, doesn't it?
Yeah. And my feeling is that, I've come to this only recently, carbon pricing is not going to do it. Tell me the price of carbon, it's going to stop Antarctica melting. But you can say, well, the quantity of carbon that would cause that to happen is, roughly speaking, given the temperature relationships when carbon increase and the feedbacks and temperature, is X billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere. Therefore, we can ration it. So rationing would work far more effectively than pricing. But can't we ration
it with price? If rather than saying $10 per tonne, I mean, Sweden, for example, charges $125 per tonne. If we said, okay, well, if you run a business and you're going to charge $125 per tonne of carbon, and you perhaps get an equally magnificent subsidy to switch to green energy, then that transformation could happen fairly quickly, couldn't it? And it would be zero cost to government.
Except for the riots from the working class who can't afford the extra price increase. And this is where the Gilets jaunes came from. Macron putting up the price of diesel had no impact upon people in Paris who can get around in the metro anyway, or wealthy enough to not even need to worry about the price of diesel. Whereas the working class and the middle class and particularly in the outside Paris have to drive to get to work, couldn't afford it, and they went on riot. So the only way you can do it is I would have a ration where everybody got the same carbon ration. And then we could have rationing trading in terms of our personal rations that way and corporate rations.
It is a rich poor question, isn't it? Even within countries, but between countries as well, because the countries that are suffering the least are going to be the rich countries, and they're therefore the ones least likely to change behaviour. The poor countries are the ones that are going to feel it the most.
Yeah. So, but it is again this left-right casting of the whole thing, which is so aggravating because it instantly puts it in their camp because they're saying, the left, socialism, communism. I'm amazed I haven't seen images of Joseph Stalin raised yet by the anti Greta Thunberg crowd, but that's the sort of vision they have. And in fact, the irony is it might well make that sort of world necessary because you'd need somebody like a Stalin to enforce the rationing we'll need when we realise just how serious this really is, and the trivialisation was completely gaga compared to the actual consequences.
Well, could the finance industry actually be part of the answer? Could we start to see investment in some countries being seen as too big a risk because of the influence they're going to have, and investors start to shy away from them? Whereas investment in newer economies and new technology, but also new technology in new economies where there's not that legacy, could we see that as providing a more positive return? So could the money go on the future rather than the legacy?
That is sort of what's happening at the moment, and that's one reason that people are saying let's divest out of coal, let's stop financing new coal mines, et cetera, and so that attitude can have an impact. That's true. Just that the trouble is if it actually goes the whole hog, it's going to have a massive impact on the profitability of not just the companies that are the coal companies. It's companies that have coal shares in their portfolio, and then the apparent value of investments and superannuation, pension funds and so on is going to crash. And then in that situation, the domestic economy, the private.
Well, not if those funds recognise what's happening and they're divesting and investing in more profitable new industries.
No, but if they've still got if the large part of their asset backing is still the valuation of shares of coal companies, and those share companies suddenly plummet towards zero, then bang, those companies are going to be bankrupt, and the banks in particular could be bankrupt. So you're in that situation where the only rescue can be by the government, and that's why I think we're people who've been trying to keep the government out of it. By this, trivialising the dangers, are going to be responsible for needing government with an iron fist, with a war economy, government-run system when we finally react to just how serious this threat is.
Right. Well, we'll leave it there because that's a good point to leave on. Because next time we're going to talk about when the government does want to spend more money. Is it going to have any impact at all? Because not just in terms of climate change, but in terms of stimulating the economy. Because if we believe Milton Friedman, I know you're a big fan, it's going to have no impact whatsoever. So we're going to look at that because of his idea of nominal value. We're going to look at that next time. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. Welcome, mate. Bye.
Yeah, we're going to get stuck into a bit more economic theory next time. That's it for the Debunking Economics podcast for this week, though. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. We'll be back again next week. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.